Well, the Austrian School of Economics, given a new lease of life by Frederich Hayek in the 70s, gave us such delights as the law of diminishing utility and opportunity cost. And they don't like government involvement in things so much either. So what does Steve Keen think of the Austrian school, and how do they differ from the pure neoclassical approach to economics? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So the Austrian School of Economics, which dates back to the 1870s, was the school that developed, or at least expanded, amongst on other things, on the theory of marginal utility and the idea that we as humans always act on a purpose. We're setting out to achieve goals, which is very bad news for marketers trying to encourage us to make an impulse purchase. But Steve, aren't they sort of like one and the same thing, really? I have a purpose. So I buy things, and those things have utility because of that purpose. It's it's more or less the same theory all wrapped into one, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm not looking at the screen at the moment, unfortunately, but I can indeed quote a well-known Austrian economist actually, who has to say his name is Karl Marx. And Marx was, of course, the absolute diametric opposite of both the neoclassical and Austrian approaches to economics. But he was quite happy to say that in an exchange, it is quite clear that one can say an exchange is an activity from which both parties gain. Yeah. Now, that is sort of in some ways the foundation, something which Austrians would agree with, and then think leads to a range of consequences which have a libertarian orientation to them, an argument that the people's action, the fact that purposeful action therefore defines what people can do. But the perspective that Marx led to is say, yeah, completely happy to agree to that, but what matters is the structure in which people make those decisions. And in that sense, the constraints under which we operate, which are the institutions we live in, the time in which these things happen and so on, actually are more important than our capacity to act purposively within those constraints. And in fact, the constraints themselves may determine what we think is purposeful action. So,
all right. So it's common sense, isn't it, that if you have an exchange, then both parties want to be part of that exchange. Therefore, both parties must be seen to be winning in some way. Otherwise, you wouldn't take part in that exchange. But what do you mean about this? It depends on the structure of it.
Well, the best example is, in fact, Milton Friedman, who's not an Austrian, of course, but he lots of sympathies to Austrians with his books like Free to Choose and stuff like that. And I've got to find the actual page reference, but buried in Free to Choose is the argument that a worker chooses to set the wage because the wage generates a higher marginal product for that person, and therefore a higher income, than working on using their own facilities. Now, that presumes, and it actually is stated at some point in Free to Choose, again, I've got to go back and find the actual point of the reference, it actually assumes that if you don't get a job, you can work with your own productive resources and produce your own goods. In effect, we all live in an economy where we own sufficient means to be able to be productive on our own.
Yeah, I've got my own car plant at the end of the garden. Costs me a bit, but I'm just as productive as the big car plant down the road.
No, you're not. No. You're slightly less productive, and therefore you'll go and take a job at the car factory in the across the road rather than the car factory in your backyard.
But I would. But the car plant, I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because the car plant over the road does have the economies of scale that I don't have.
Yeah, but the thing is, you haven't got the car plant either, and this is the point. It's presuming that you have the choice you make is, in a sense, voluntary as an option between one thing and another thing. This relates to something else we intend talking about soon, opportunity cost.
Yeah.
But it's presuming that there's a gradation. We can all be peasant farmers and provide for our own needs out of our farm, or we can go and work for a wage. And because we go and work for a wage, therefore, we're doing it because of a higher marginal product, not the fact that we are landless labourers, which was a large part where the dispossession of people from the land, which was what they had as both rights and obligations in the feudal structure. That process of enclosure and driving people off the land was a large part of generating the industrial workforce of the workforce of the Industrial Revolution. And what you therefore get is people making a praxeological free choice in the choice where they've got a choice between starving or going and working in one of those quote unquote dark satanic mills.
There's the opportunity cost. You mentioned Karl Marx because, of course, his theory was that the value of something was determined by the labor involved in producing it, which seems counterintuitive as well, because diamonds are valuable. T-shirts from a sweatshop are cheap. It's the labor involved in picking up those diamonds is, not going to be that many times greater than the labor involved in creating that t-shirt in the sweatshop. Well,
I mean, Marx would argue, in fact, that the labor was greater in terms of getting the minerals out of the ground. But the fundamental thing is one school is saying, and this is the Austrian school of thought, is saying that valuation is subjective. The valuation somebody puts on something reflects the utility they get out of it, and that is unknowable to any other person and incomparable between people. So, and whereas Marx is saying that it comes down to the effort. The effort determines value, and that can be quantified, and the relative prices are based on the degree of effort. Now, I think actually both schools are wrong. I'm going to go right back to my energy analysis and in putting a perspective on that. But the Austrian perspective, which is one we're discussing now, fundamentally ends up saying, and this is where it ends up having its what people from the left would see as reactionary attitudes, saying you cannot say that Jeff Bezos gets less utility out of an extra dollar than a homeless person does. Now, in fact, that was Gunnar Myrdal made some good points on that front as well, and said that an obvious implication of marginal utility theory, when it was first developed by J.B. Clark back at the end of the 19th century, was that clearly poor people get more utility out of extra money than a rich person does, because they're about to die. If they're on the borderline, in other words, they may starve to death without the extra dollar, whereas the rich person obviously is not going to suffer privation by losing that dollar. So therefore, there's an argument for redistribution. This, of course, is getting beyond the Austrian perspective. It's more neoclassical in some ways. There's an argument for redistribution. But the comeback would say, no, we really cannot say whether or not the subjective value that the billionaire gets from the extra dollar is smaller than the subjective value they get from the poor person gets from the extra dollar. So we don't really know whether we're increasing total utility by taking a dollar off the poor person and giving it to the rich, or vice versa. What we have to do is work out, and this is again very neoclassical. I know the Austrians don't have this concept in their repertoire, but it's worth discussing. This is where the idea of what's called Pareto optimality came from. Ever heard that piece of jargon?
No.
Oh, lucky you.
The what? Okay. The what optimality?
Pareto optimality.
Right. Now, I've somehow managed to get through my 54 years or whatever it is without that. I don't know how I managed.
You're quite a proud man. Okay. This is an argument from an Italian engineer turned economist called Vilfredo Pareto. And facing the whole issue of, and this is where a large part of the disputes between schools of economics comes from, of course, whether one should or should not redistribute income from rich to poor or vice versa. Given the fact that you can make these sorts of arguments, and this sort of angel on the head of pin stuff was a big deal for the intellectual community back at the end of the 19th century and right through the 20th. You can't compare one person's subjective utility to another person's subjective utility, which is a position that both Austrians and neoclassicals are inclined towards. He said, what we need to find is changes which are optimal in the sense that they make no one worse off and at least one person better off. And that's what's called a Pareto optimal change. Now, in that situation, you rule out redistribution from, say, let's take a random rich person, let's say Rupert. His name is Rupert. Just for the heck of it, Rupert, okay? Taking $1 off Rupert and giving it to, let's say, a bloke called Phil. That would not be a Pareto optimal change, and therefore economic theory, which is the neoclassical theory, would say, well, we'd recommend against that sort of non-Pareto optimal change. But if we can find a way that we make Phil $1 better off, while Rupert gets no better off, then that's a worthwhile policy to pursue.
Now, I really did enjoy this discussion about the Austrian School with Steve Keen. I learned an awful lot from it, and that is just the beginning third of the podcast. If you want to hear the last 2/3, the half an hour or so discussing the Austrian School of Economics, then you need to subscribe to this podcast. And you can do that in one of two ways. Either you can go to debunkingeconomics.com and choose one of the subscription options there, or you can become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you pledge $10 or more support each month to his work in changing the dimensions of economics, then you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. And there's heaps of them now. So hopefully you'll do one of those two things, and we'll see you back here very soon. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.